Hello, YouTube. It's the Utopian Buddha. So today I want to talk about the two centers of consciousness that exist in you right now, right? So first, there is the ego, which is the center of your conscious identity, right? It's the little self. And then there is the big self with a capital S, and that is the reality. You can call it God or the transcendental reality within you, which is the source of you that you are not aware of, right? That it's a higher dimensional reality beyond you that is the core of who you are, and it is who you are on the deepest level. The ego thinks that it is the doer, right? The ego thinks that I'm doing this stuff, but when you really look at it, you don't beat your heart, you don't breathe for yourself. The universe is doing all of this for your body, and it's orchestrating the trillions of cells of your body. And also on an external level, right? Your relationship to other people, your relationship to the world. It's if your ego is doing it, that means it's a separate sense of self. And there's always a navigation or a discussion or an interaction or a dialogue or a negotiation. That's the word I was looking for. A negotiation of the ego and the self, right? The self encompasses the ego. The self is the center of the ego. So there's naturally, in the right kind of psychological structure, there is a harmonious relationship between the self and the ego. Sri Ramakrishna famously said it is impossible to completely negate the ego, right? And Sri Ramakrishna was a super realized saint. So the ego is always going to be there on some small, subtle, in some subtle way to help the self navigate through reality, because you still need a stable identity, because you are an individual little self as well as a big self, right? Because the ego is truth as well if looked at from the right perspective, right? But at the end of the day, your thoughts and the relationship between your consciousness and your thoughts determines how established you are in the self, right? If your thoughts are always self-centered, if they're always thinking, if they're always worrying, if your thoughts are always going, and all you're doing is thinking about yourself and your little life and your little problems, that's mostly ego, right? The ego stems from excessive psychological thinking that is tied to the mind and body, right? That's why some of the greatest philosophers of history were self-transcendent sages, because their thoughts were not focused on the little me. Their thoughts were focused on God and the universe and world peace and stuff. So that's the relationship or the negotiation between the ego and the self. And there is an ego-self axis, right? A connection between you and God, and you are not God and you are God, right? Sometimes I identify as the self. And that's the truest part of myself, right? That's when I am at my highest truth. But other times I'm down in my ego thinking stupid thoughts. But we don't want to demonize the ego, right? Sometimes the ego is essential for effectively engaging with reality, but the ego has to be plugged into the self in order to completely, engage with the world in the most harmonious way, right? If you just get out of your own way, what does that mean? Well, if the ego gets out of the way of the self, if man gets out of the way and lets the universe work through him, then I think the world will be a much better place. So have a good one, guys.